Story 1. A friend of my dad's would babysit me sometimes when I was little. Mom wasn't in the picture, and he used to tell a story to me that scares the absolute shit out of me to this day. Dad's friend, I'll call him Bob, is driving a rig out in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, Oregon. He has to make the delivery by the following morning, so he decides to just drive through the night. It's like 1 a.m. No one else is out on the roads. Hasn't seen another car in probably 100 miles. He's literally in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, the whole entire sky lights up. Instantly, like daylight. Bob fucking slams on the brakes. Has no idea what the hell is going on. Everything stays lit up for a good solid 10 seconds. He can see everything. Whatever's happening, it's not lightning. It doesn't stop or flicker at all. Bob hunkers down, anticipating imminent nuclear devastation. Suddenly, the sky goes dark again. No sound, no blast wave. He sits there in the middle of the road waiting for almost 5 minutes, then decides to keep going. Figures it was a meteor or something. Goes about 2 miles up the road and sees a car with its flashers on, stopped in the middle of the road. Stops a good distance away from it. There's not enough room to go around it. Front end of the car is crumpled like it hit something. Bob figures they probably hit a deer that got spooked whenever the meteor went over and ran into the road. He gets out of the cab and goes to see if the driver is okay. Driver is sitting on the ground by the driver's side door. Has his knees up and is resting his head on his arms. "Hey buddy, you okay?" Bob calls. He stops about 10 feet away for seemingly no reason. Something about the whole situation feels weird. Bob is one of those guys that always listens to his gut, so he stays put. "God, my head is killing me," the guy says. But he doesn't lift his head up, so it's muffled. "Did you hit a deer?" Bob asks. He's getting more and more uneasy. Something's wrong. But he still can't figure out what exactly it is. The guy says he thinks he might have hurt his head. Asks Bob to please help him. Bob takes a step forward, but his instincts are going apeshit. He looks at everything again. And that's when he notices it. The fucking car is all wrong. It looks like what someone thinks a car looks like. It has all the right pieces, but there's nothing extra, if that makes sense. Bob says it looked like a cheap Hot Wheels knockoff. It just looked wonky and wrong. He looks around at the back of the car and realizes that not only is there no license plate, there's not even a trunk. It's just one solid piece of material with taillights put in it. There's no manufacturer or model names. Bob knows cars, and this thing is nothing he's ever seen before. From where he's standing, he can see there's no tailpipe or even hubcaps. It's just the shape of a car. He starts to back up and the guy asks him for help again. Bob tells him he can't help him and that he'll call a tow truck when he gets to the next town. The guy lifts his head and looks at Bob. And tells him he thinks he might have a concussion. Something is really, really wrong with the guy's face. But again, it takes a second for Bob to figure it out. The next part is exactly how Bob described it. Everything on the man's face was where it should have been, in their normal positions. He looked totally normal. Except for the fact that his eyes and mouth were on upside down. Bob goes apeshit and sprints back to his rig. Climbs in and locks the door just in time for the man to slam into the door behind him. How the fuck did he get there so fast? He knocks on the glass and smiles at Bob, but because his mouth is upside down, it looks like he's screaming. Tells Bob to open the door so he can come in. Bob fucking floors it. Doesn't care if he hits the guy or not. His truck easily pushes the car out of the way. Whatever it is, it's light, and it makes no sound when he hits it. Unfortunately, it's an anticlimactic ending. Bob got where he was going fine, with no other problems. My dad knows the story, but I don't think he believes it. But Bob tells it to everyone he meets, so he obviously does. He's absolutely adamant about the guy being an alien. Years later, I heard about the Thatcher effect, and nearly had a fucking heart attack when I saw it. I showed one of the pictures to Bob, and he wouldn't even look at it. He says, it's exactly what the guy looked like. Story 2. When I was still working on my master's, I landed a job working part-time at a paper. It was a small-time thing, and I mainly applied because I enjoyed writing, and it was pretty easy part-time work, not because I was serious about becoming a journalist. However, the boss man went ahead and saddled me with a big feature article covering the poorest neighborhood in the city. I was really green, but my boss told me my writing style would help me suit the subject matter. So I'm scheduled to meet up with this guy, Reverend Downey. His job is to explain a bit of the neighborhood's history to me, as well as to introduce me to a few interesting locals. So, one morning I meet up with him at his office, in the neighborhood church. Reverend Downey turns out to be hilarious. He tells me all about the neighborhood, mixing in bits of history with funny anecdotes, all great stuff from my article. As he talks, I'm taking notes, when I hear a crowd gathering outside. He tells me it's the weekly food pantry setting up inside the church. Also mentions the needle ladies showing up. Needle ladies? I ask. It's a group of women who set up a needle exchange on the church grounds. Drug addicts show up, tell them how many needles they need to use daily, and the women gave them fresh needles for a week and take their used ones. The Reverend excuses himself to go check up on things. Meanwhile, I get up to stretch my legs. I step outside of the office where a crowd of women and children bustle about, picking out canned items spread out over a few different tables. Through a doorway on the far side, I can see out into the courtyard where the Reverend is talking to the needle ladies as they set up tables. I'm watching the dead-eyed druggies waiting in line when I feel a tug on my shirt. Turn around. There's a little black boy looking up at me, a giant smile on his face. "They got a nothing man buried outside," he says. At first I think he says, "Muffin man." "A nothing man," he repeats. "I can see everything from my window. They made it inside. Then they took him outside and buried him." He points behind me and says, "Right there." I turn around to see Reverend Downey walking back inside. He says in his big warm voice, "Come on out. I want you to meet someone special." I turn around to say goodbye to the kid, but he's gone. I'm introduced to Grandma Kane, who's raising her 4 grandchildren by herself. The children all have AIDS, Reverend Downey tells me. Grandma Kane and the 4 children live in a tiny room in a rundown apartment building down the street, and I walk back there with them to do a mini interview. The apartment building is absolute shit. Elevators don't work, parts of the ceiling are missing, holes in the walls exposing the wiring beneath. There's also no air conditioning, and it's the height of summer, so we're boiling as I'm interviewing frail Grandma Kane next to an open window. They don't all have AIDS, she says to the children. Just 3 do and 1 don't. Basically, their mother was a heroin junkie who spent most of her life in and out of jail. She essentially hoarded herself out for drug money non-stop, and so all the kids have different fathers. Mom eventually went away to prison for good, and the kids went to live with their grandma. What about the 4th child? I ask. The one who doesn't have AIDS. The oldest, Grandma Kane tells me. Martha. She claims that Martha was not born with AIDS, and that she's been tested, a very rare thing in that particular neighborhood. She also claims Martha was assaulted when she was about 9 years old. Didn't get AIDS then either, luckily, but the event traumatized her. It was like a switch flipped in the poor girl's head. Martha started spending all of her time running around the neighborhood with drug dealers and criminals. She's only 13, but she's already had 2 abortions. I ask Grandma Kane if she knows who did it. She refuses to tell me. This kind of surprises me. She's been really forthcoming to this point. I assume that she's afraid of someone. Was it one of the drug dealers? No, she says. So then it was one of the neighborhood boys, I say. Or a man, maybe a grown man. No, it wasn't one of them. She seems to be getting more and more nervous as I ask her about it. And then she says something that leaves me puzzled. Everyone knows about the criminals and drug dealers, but see, nobody knows the truth about around here. I ask her, what's the truth about around here? She seems exasperated and finally says, it's just, there's worse things out here than drug dealers. I press her. What do you mean? What things? She looks me dead in the eye and makes a motion like she's zipping her lips closed. My curiosity is piqued by this point, so I tell her we can do things off the record. I always wanted to say that, if that's what she wants. So I turn off my recorder. She's fidgeting now, staring out the window. Before she seemed nervous, but now it's like she's scared. I ask, is someone threatening you to keep you quiet? She shakes her head. I ask, who are you afraid of? And she snaps at me. It's not a who, boy. Instantly, her body relaxes and her eyes seem to glaze over. She turns and looks out the window. At first I think she's ignoring me, but then I notice her chest isn't moving. She's not breathing. I'll cut to the chase. She died right fucking there. With the grandkids screaming and crying and crowding around her, I called 911. Nobody shows up and an hour's passed, so I call again. This time I tell them I'm a reporter and that a woman is dead. Dispatcher says the police will be right over. And they are. 2 squad cars, but no ambulance. And then it hits me. Nobody's even coming to remove Grandma Kane's corpse. After a short chat with the police, I explain what happened. They tell me to leave the premises and assure me that the body will be dealt with. Then they put the kids in the back of the car and I ask where they'll be taken. One of the officers says, probably the prison. They got a childcare facility down there. He wasn't joking either. By this point, it's almost dark and I have to go home. I make the walk back to my car and I'm passing the church courtyard when I hear a familiar voice. You want to see where they put it? I turn around and it's a little black kid from earlier with a big goofy smile on his face. After the shit that I went through, his silly grin kind of catches me off guard and I find myself laughing a little. They put something on top of Nothing Man's grave, he tells me. You can see it poking out like a belly button. He points towards the churchyard. Don't ask me why, but I felt the urge to walk over and inspect the churchyard, so I did. I know he's probably just telling stories, but I guess I'm partly on autopilot, processing the events of the afternoon. After a minute of looking, I found a patch of dirt that looks like it's been recently dug up. And in the center, there's something that kind of sparkles in the low moonlight. I reach towards it, and then I pull my hand back. Squeezed into a little groove in the dirt, right in the center of the freshly dug dirt, is a human eye staring up at me. I gag and step back, and then I hear another familiar voice. "Did you find something?" It's Reverend Downey. He's leaning in the doorway of the church, almost completely hidden by the shadows. For a moment, I'm at a loss for words, and then I point down at my feet. "Have you seen this?" But he doesn't respond to that. He just says, "Kept an eye on your car for you." Before I can respond, he says, "You gotta keep an eye on things around here, or they'll disappear." He's not smiling now, and there's no warmth in his voice like before during our interview. "You know, things go missing around here all the time," he tells me. "Cars, people, and the cops, they don't even bother investigating." I get myself collected and ask, "Is someone buried here?" Reverend Downey steps out of the shadows and says, "I heard about Grandma Kane." There's an odd expression on his face. And it finally dawns on me that I'm being threatened. "No, if I weren't a reverend, I might bet you they never find what killed her," he says. "And I'd win that bet." "Who the hell's buried here?" I ask. "It's not a who," he says. "It's a what." I begin to feel nauseous and dizzy. "And you're gonna find out just what that is if you don't step back from that goddamn grave." He grabs my hand and yanks me back, away from the ring of recently dug dirt and from the eye in the ground. And I instantly feel better. I notice then that the Reverend is sweating heavily. His hand is on his chest, his fingers searching for his crucifix. He tells me to get on home now, and I hear a strange sound. An odd humming that seems to be coming from underneath the grave. I don't even think twice. I scramble to my car, fire the ignition, and peel the hell out of there, away from the church and away from the neighborhood. As I'm driving, I pass Grandma Kane's apartment building. Glancing up at her small window, I can still see the dead body sitting up in its chair. I'm not sure if it was my imagination, or the shadows, or the fear, or what, but it looked like it was missing an eye. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with the article after that. In the end, I wound up taking an easy route and writing a feature piece like I was asked to, focusing on the emotional struggles of living in the ghetto, ignoring all the truly disturbing things I'd seen. I spoke to a local poet and some recovering addicts to build my piece, but I steered clear of the church and of Reverend Downey as well. At some point, though, I couldn't help bringing up something to the poet I was interviewing. He was really knowledgeable, and he was kind of a historian around the neighborhood, so I asked him if he'd heard anything about something called the Nothing Man. His reaction left me wondering. There was a brief flash of recognition in his eyes, but he insisted, "I only know the name." He knew of it as an old urban folktale, popular in the neighborhood long before he'd been born, and that it was now largely forgotten. It's like something you might have heard kids talking about during the Great Depression. A spooky story to scare each other, but beyond that, I gotta be honest, I have no earthly idea. I wasn't going to say, but this was in New York. Finding the neighborhood I was in might be easy, but the paper was small enough now that you likely won't find any article, or me. Story 3. Late shift at call center. Just me and one other guy in the building. He takes a call that sounds like an old person who stayed up late and figured this would be the time to figure out their new laptop. Well, he's desperately trying to explain that we just support her internet connection, not her devices.
I get that annoying beep in my ear that tells me that some asshole's on the line. I give the usual opening line. "Thanks for calling. This is Anon. Can I get your name and phone number?" He asks, "Hello?" Shit, my mic is muted. No, it isn't. "Hello?" I ask back, briefly thinking how odd it is that this is one of the very few questions that's appropriately responded to with the exact same question. He asks if this is the company that I work for. I say yes and give him the line again. Ask, "How can I help you?" He says none of his electronics are working and he thinks it's the internet. Ask for his house phone. Gives an area code I don't recognize. I type it in anyways because who am I to question a customer this early into the call? Nothing. So I ask for his name, as he's likely screwed up the number. He gives me his name and I do the slow-ass search by name function. Ask about troubleshooting while it comes up. He says he doesn't know where his modem is because he can't leave his room. I ask what he means. He says his door won't open, but the one time it did, there was nothing but blackness. I only now am noticing how pronounced the static on the line was. I originally thought it to be a filtering issue with the phones and DSL line, which is a common occurrence, but this static was a lot more front and center. Search finishes. Nothing. Google his area code. He's in Texas. We only support shit in Saskatchewan, Canada. He asks if I know why his family left. I ask him where he lives. Gives me a town in Texas. Ask him what the date is, claiming it's a security question. He says the date is November of 2011. This was August 2012. Coworker finished his call at this point and clocked out, and it's a couple minutes to midnight, which is the end of our shift. He's at my desk making a face that says, "Why did you ask what the date was, and why do you look like someone shit in your ear?" I asked the guy on the other end of the line when his internet stopped working. He says he thinks someone unplugged something because someone entered his house and then the blackness came and nothing was working. After he says this, the line goes dead. I explain to my coworker what just happened. He says to write down the ticket number and see if the guy calls back under the same number or what. So I write it down and the guy's name as well, so I remember what the ticket was about. Jorge Vargas. I asked my supervisor to pull up the call as they're all recorded, the next shift I have. She finds it. We listen to it at lunch. The call comes in. There's no caller ID. Everything is just like it happened that night except for one key detail. In the recording, I'm the only one talking. The other side of the line is dead air. No static or anything. My supervisor's really good-natured and has a good sense of humor and asks if it was a prank or something, or if I had someone call from an unlisted number and do this to try to spook her. I try to convince her otherwise, and my coworker later vouches that I was really scared looking. Only my coworker believes me, really. I Google Jorge Vargas and get an actor. I put Texas near the end and find this. It turns out he actually lived in Texas City, and the town name he gave me was Amburn, which was actually the street. I'll let you in on another detail that I felt compelled to leave out, but I'm already telling the story, so I figure why not. I usually have a pretty active imagination, and if it was any other call, I would have attributed it to said imagination, but I could swear that I heard other voices in the static. I tell myself it was either the TVs that we set up or the one in the break room, but the TVs in the call center are usually muted for obvious reasons, and the break room TV's never on. A coworker agreed to close up the building and let me go home after the call, so I kind of buggered off out of there quick. The OP then posts a link to a news article which is titled, "Second Man Gets Life in Prison for Role in 2011 Double Slaying." It reads, "Police discovered the bodies of Jorge Vargas, 33, and his daughter, Miranda Vargas, inside their house on the 700 block of Amburn on November 21st, 2011, in Texas City." Story 4. "17 years ago,
little kid in the 5th grade. Every day during recess, me and my friend, who we'll call Kevin, would hang out. Our favorite spot was a radiator, which was positioned in a far corner of the playground next to a wired fence that separated the school from a trailer park on the other side. We spent the majority of our recesses here. However, by the time we both reached 3rd grade, there was a rather large drug bust at the trailer park, causing a lot of the residents to move and leave it mostly vacant. One trailer remains. Looks rusty. Over time, more and more vacancy notices are posted by the city on the door, but nobody ever receives them. Guess everyone just stopped giving a shit about it after a while. One day, me and my friend are eating lunch outside during recess. We're both facing the fence in the abandoned trailer park. Out of nowhere, we see a white flash from beyond the fence. Almost didn't notice it with the sun being out, but still just barely noticeable. At first, we think nothing of it and don't tell anyone about it either. However, over the next few weeks, it started happening more and more frequently, until we would see it pretty much every day during recess. Decide to tell one of the staff helpers about it, and she immediately calls the police. Didn't hear anything else about it after that. I'm walking home with my friend from a birthday party a few months down the line. We split off as we both lived on different streets, say goodbye, and I tell him to log on to RuneScape when he gets home. Yeah, this was when RuneScape was pretty new. Sue me. Sitting on my computer mindlessly hours later. Notice he never came on. Didn't show up to school the next day either. Odd. Days pass and I still haven't seen him. Word starts to spread around the town that he's sick. I ask my parents if I can go visit him since he's sick one day, and they both exchange worried glances. Later, my dad tells me that he's visiting his grandparents in Chicago. Fast forward again. Sitting at lunch alone on top of the radiator by myself. It's been literally months since I've seen Kevin. Getting pretty lonely. See that stupid flash again from beyond the fence and get pissed off. Run up to the staff helper and tell her the trailer's flashing at me again. She tells me she already took care of it and it's just my imagination. Whatever. Tell my parents about it that night. One of my dad's friends worked in the local police department. The very next day, recess has to be held in the inside gym. Teachers won't tell us why. Next day, the trailer's gone and the area surrounding it's been surrounded with yellow tape, and the fence is later redone and boarded up instead of being chain-linked. Somehow I get the feeling I'll never see my friend again at this point. Years pass and I forget about it, until recently when I went back to my home to visit my parents and we drove past my old elementary school. The trailer park's gone and where it used to be a daycare sits instead. While driving, I decided to ask my mom what really happened to Kevin. Apparently, my dad's police department friend and his coworker investigated that trailer again, and inside of the trailer, they found a stash of pictures, around 20 in total, of me and my friend sitting on that radiator during recess. And alongside that, a couple of me sitting by myself after Kevin had gone missing. It really bugged me that they lied to me all these years, but his body was never found, so I guess there's that. Whenever I think about how close I came to being in his shoes, I shudder. I don't think I'll ever know if he's dead or alive, or if they found out who even did it. But that's by far my most disturbing childhood experience. Story 5. When I was younger, I had the misfortune of knowing someone who I believe to this day is an actual and complete psychopath. I'll just call him Frank. I met Frank in an after-school daycare in 2nd grade, and we were insta-friends. He was the only friend I ever had there. The owner was a shithead who encouraged kids to bully each other for entertainment. She's in jail now, so no other friends were made. 3 months later, in the summer between 2nd and 3rd grade, we had a field trip to the local pool, and Frank and I were just doing our thing. Then he stops talking mid-sentence and stares out into the open. We were having a pretty mundane conversation, too. I don't even remember what it was. A flash of rage crosses his face.
subsiding to a calculating expression of premeditated violence. Another flash of rage and he punches me in the face. We were in the deep end and little me was pretty weak. He presses his thumbs into my larynx and holds me underwater. I remember holding my breath, kicking him, trying to move his arms away, and worse yet, I remember seeing his face through the ripples. I feel like he was just gazing down at me blankly. His expression was so neutral that it must have looked like nothing was happening to outsiders. 35 seconds. I couldn't hold it anymore. Then I remember more splashing, frantic, feet and fists flying around me. An older girl dragged me out of the water at the last second while another boy my age wrestled Frank off me. Frank fought back and the other guy broke his nose, but the way it happened, it almost seemed like he was just letting it happen. And then he went to crying, and the lifeguards and the owner came and he started bawling his eyes out. I saw pain, regret, fear, shame, all in his face, pushing tears out with their enormous weight. Or so I thought, for maybe a second. For just a moment, not even 4 seconds, there was nobody looking at Frank. The lifeguards were seeing if I was okay. Any parents present had tuned the situation out almost immediately. The girl was off to the side defending her brother's actions, and the daycare lady had turned around to yell at him instead of consoling what she also thought were some genuine emotions on Frank's part. Literally the second no one was seeing what he was doing, Frank's head was pointed at me. It was so frighteningly instantaneous that I was looking right at him, and I felt like I didn't even see his head move. It was one position, and then it was in the next, like no motion in between. He was blank again. No emotions, no sobs, tears drying on his face. That look slowly turned back into that expression of calculation. Brows raised, chin up, sides of his mouth tense. The face of premeditated violence. I was so scared of this I started crying. And then, as the daycare lady began turning back towards him, before they should have even been able to see each other, he looked up at her and resumed his sobbing. Everyone believed his side of the story, that I had dared him to hold me under to scare the lifeguards. No one believed me, or the older girl, or the other boy. No one. It's been over 10 years, and there's still no one on this earth that I fear more than Frank, and nothing I remember more clearly than that day. And the worst part is, I have more Frank stories. That was just the first. Grade 4 was the next time I met Frank. He was in my class. I begged and begged the principals and the counselors and just about anyone who would listen to put me in a different class. Whenever I saw Frank, he was staring at my friend, who we'll call Jane. Every time she caught him staring, he didn't quickly look away like any other 4th grade boy would when he was discovering that, hey, girls aren't so bad. If anything, I think this was his version of a first crush. But he would never avert his gaze. No matter how many times she caught him, he would just keep staring. He would never stop until a few minutes after she would try to make him stop. I remember during recess one day he walked up to her and asked to speak to her alone. Some of her bratty little girl friends heard this and made the usual ooh sound, so she felt pressure to go and talk to him. Jane's friends walked away and I just stood there watching them, and Frank whispered something in Jane's ear, and then she looked terrified. She stood there, tears in her eyes and total shock on her face. Frank stepped towards her, pushing his chest out and looking angrily down his nose at her. Her feet were glued to the ground, and she was just staring at him, seemingly afraid to break eye contact, sobbing quietly and looking terrified. I couldn't move either. I was too shocked by what I saw to step in. After a full 30 seconds of this, he smiled and bade her a polite bye-bye. He walked away and she ran towards me, burying her face into my shoulder and sobbing. She wouldn't tell me what he said, and she didn't speak to any of the other students for the next 5 days. Then, she was moved to a different school, and my wish to change classes was abruptly granted. I had no Frank to worry about now. I still saw Frank around the school and whatnot, but it was years before he ever paid me any attention again. He had plenty of friends by 5th grade, and he was smiley and nice and acting normal and all, so at the time I thought he was fine. Jane, on the other hand, I was always suspicious. Always worried about what had become of her. The next time I saw Jane was a full 7 years later, in 11th grade. She didn't look anorexic or anything, but she was so small and delicate. I talked to her for a few hours, and we caught up with each other on everything that had happened since then. Mostly she had a nervous frown on her face, avoiding eye contact and speaking softly. She looked down, stroking her hand across her opposite shoulder whenever she spoke.
A couple times I put my hand on her shoulder and I said just the right thing and she'd smile and chuckle a bit. There was a lot of small talk, but we also told each other where we'd been since grade 4. I stayed in the same town, same school system the entire time. She always missed her friends here, and the day that Frank died, she and her parents started making plans to return. She'd taken the rest of grade 4 off, and it even took months for her therapist to get her to repeat Frank's words. She still won't tell me what he said, that this was the only time she ever repeated it. She was homeschooled in grade 5 and 6 on the other end of the province, and after that she went to a normal school and had some normal times. To this day, she's incredibly timid, except for the few moments we've had, but still very happy and stable. The only lapses in her mental stability seem to be when someone mentioned Frank, psychopaths in general, or, worryingly enough, assault. Then she gets paranoid, and stays that way for a few days. In grades 5 and 6, I didn't pay much attention to Frank. Everything I remember him doing in that period was pretty normal. He went everywhere on a bicycle, had his first girlfriend, and I think he was on a soccer team or something. I didn't talk to him, but he had plenty of friends and seemed well adjusted. Maybe he just had little boy problems. I think we all remember 2 or 3 little boys with anger problems when they're little that kind of just go away eventually. I thought that was the case with Frank. Then enter grade 7. Frank was in my class again that year, and he kind of started to freak out people after a while. Every 7th grader wanted to be a badass, but Frank never shut up about knives, guns, and porn. Everyone, including his friends and even teachers, started getting really scared of him again. Being fairly nice for a 12-year-old, I figured he just needed someone to spend time with, so I volunteered to spend some afternoons and we hung out a few times a month. He had a much better home life than I would have thought. His dad died when he was little, but his mom was a lovely lady. After being a guest at our house, I could understand why your mom jokes made Frank so angry. Things were good. Frank started seeming really well adjusted again, and in around January, and we had a bit of a friend group going. Then Frank started showing me things. He owned dozens of knives, hunting and combat and utility, all sorts. His mother didn't know about them. He started bringing them to school with him. I think I was the only person who knew. He would show only me during lunch every day. He'd pull a different little one out of his pocket and say, just in case. I thought he was paranoid about other people. In March, tensions built between Frank and another boy who we'll call Douche Canoe. I don't even remember what they were fighting about. It was whatever pisses off 13-year-old boys, I guess. I saw Frank giving Douche Canoe that blank stare. The one I'd forgotten. The one that I'd feared. It was during class. Douche Canoe noticed and told Frank to stop. Frank didn't even blink. He sat and kept staring, just like he'd done to Jane. Knowing that a fight was coming, and I've never been much of a fighter myself, I did the only thing I could do to help Douche Canoe. At the beginning of lunch break, when the fight was soon to go down, I picked Frank's pocket and threw his knife down a storm drain. Frank stared Douche Canoe down. Douche Canoe was terrified. Frank once again had the face of premeditated violence. I remember his shoulders looking broad and square under his old leather coat. Frank marched towards Douche Canoe with the same body language used on Jane. Douche Canoe panicked and swung first, but Frank moved so fast it was like Douche Canoe's arm snapped itself. Frank drove his foot into Douche Canoe's jaw and tackled him to the ground. He reached for his pocket and found nothing. I'm glad I took the knife. I remember Frank's blank face throughout the whole thing. He looked bored as he pounded Douche Canoe's head into the dirt. The chanting and jeering stopped and everyone just watched in silent horror. Frank's alternated arms with punches, and each one was exactly 1 second after the last, but each individual punch was frightening. He would raise a fist up behind his head and drive it into Douche Canoe's face in an imperceptible fraction of a second. I sure hope the teachers were doing something really damn important that kept them from intervening for a whole 3 minutes, and the kids who'd gathered, including myself, were crying in empathy and fear for Douche Canoe as Frank stood up, faced the teacher, and said without blinking or smiling or anything, "Call him an ambulance." Frank got a 10-day suspension. Douche Canoe got 2 months in the hospital. The scariest thing about how Frank died is that it wasn't the last time Jane or I ever saw him. There's always a group of boys who do this in 8th grade, start a gang, walking around their suburban town with untouched knives in their pockets, running around and hiding like criminals when their only crime is occasional loitering. Every 8th grader wants to be a badass. The difference with Frank is that while his friends grew out of it, Frank grew into it. Grade 10 is when high school starts in my province, and while it's a great school and a super fun time, it exposes you to the fact that even the quaintest little burbs aren't completely innocent. In fact, being as close to the mountains as we were in our town made it into quite a cutesy little drug highway. Frank became a drug dealer. The rumor to this day is that Frank never took any narcotics, not even once. The guy was just crazy on his own. I wasn't the best high schooler either, so I was with a client of his during a trade once. Frank did it the whole time. The stare. Maybe he was doing it on purpose, using his reputation to intimidate. Maybe he was just doing it. I don't know. There was even a rumor going around that he had forced himself on a girl. The last year of Frank's life was fairly shrouded in rumors, but there were a few that I didn't believe. This was one I didn't need to believe because Frank told me it was true himself. I saw Frank the night before he died. It was the first time I'd ever seen him afraid. We bumped into each other near Tim Hortons and had a coffee and talked for a while. He didn't understand what he had done to people. He didn't understand why everybody was freaking out about the rumor that he had assaulted someone. We talked about her and Jane and Douche Canoe and countless other people he wronged. He just didn't get it. He called them cattle, sheep, human livestock. He didn't give a shit, and he didn't understand why anybody else would either. It's not like they're important anyway. I tried to get up and leave. He put a firm hand on my shoulder and pulled me back onto my chair. Suddenly, and for the first time that I know, he looked afraid. Vulnerable, even. He explained to me that his boss lived in the nearby city and was a scary and powerful gangster. For reasons I still don't know to this day, Frank and his boss had a falling out. The look that trickled onto Frank's face. Eyebrows raised, chin up, sides of the mouth tensed. The face of malevolence. I had just gotten my driver's license and Frank asked me to drive him to the city. Ordered me. I was afraid to say no. We didn't talk on the way there. The last time I ever saw Frank, he was pulling a pistol out of his coat. He told me to pull over, and he got out and walked away. I drove away as fast as I could. He must have stayed somewhere overnight. The next day, there was a news report of a gunfight but no known fatalities, and a few days later, Frank's stepdad reported him missing. After a week of uncertainty, a body matching Frank's description was pulled out of a dumpster by a police officer, rotting and riddled with bullet holes and shrapnel. The scariest part? I lied when I said that was the last time I ever saw Frank. I'll tell you the end. I don't know if the mainstream media bothered with this, but the local news went crazy for weeks. The bodies of all sorts of gangsters started showing up dead out of nowhere. A body matching Frank's description had been found, but it was mutilated. Very few people know that he's in fact alive today, and Frank isn't his real name, so don't bother. My theory is that he spent part of that first day picking off his aggressors one by one, and finishing by pitting the last few against some poor schmuck who was about the same height, weight, and hair color. But really, that's all conjecture on my part. I don't know how he did it. It's not like he just have a twin lying around at his disposal. A year after graduating high school, Jane and I were at my apartment catching up. I'd cleaned up my act a lot since 10th grade, and Jane had a fairly spotless act to begin with. She was so relaxed that day. The air of nervousness, the tension she carried around, was absent. She was quiet as ever. I suppose she just has a small voice, but she wasn't timid. My buzzer went off. I can't explain how or why I felt so uneasy. I opened the door, Jane close on my heels, to see Frank turning to walk down the staircase. We saw him, but he didn't see us. I don't think he knows that we know he's alive. Jane was silent. I was shocked and angry, but I let that go when I knew she needed some calming down. I don't know if it was a sick joke or something, but if you read the first story on this thread, this'll almost disgust you. He only left 2 things on my doormat. A pair of water wings and a snorkel.